we have 100% control over our bodies and our choices and our reactions. And we have 0% control over anything else. And my problem going into the hospital when I was first diagnosed is that I thought I had 100% control over everything outside of me, and I'd forgotten how to have responsibility over what was happening inside me.
Welcome to the Women Inspired Podcast, brought to you by Modern Well, a beautiful woman-centered collaborative workspace in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm your host, April Seifert, psychologist, entrepreneur, and self-proclaimed life experience junkie. Each week, I will introduce you to a different woman who is succeeding and inspiring others in one way or another. We'll dive into her story, her successes, failures, and the lessons she has learned along the way, all with the goal of inspiring you to listen to that inner voice who keeps reminding you that there is something you want to take action on. You are so much more capable and powerful than you give yourself credit for. Inside of you is a woman on fire. Let's let her out and see what happens. Here we go. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Women Inspired Podcast. My name is April Seifert, and I'm your host. And today you are meeting a woman who I swear you are going to think I paid her to be on this podcast and paid her to say the things that she is going to say during her interview. It was such an incredible conversation that summed up so many of the things that we talk about on the podcast week after week after week, and they are all wrapped up in a beautiful little package with this interview. So this week, you are going to meet the amazing Lydia Slaby, and she is the author of the book, Wait, It Gets Worse, Love, Death, and My Transformation from Control Freak to Human Being. So Lydia faced the diagnosis of lymphoma. Lydia went through an extremely scary diagnostic situation where she basically went to the doctor thinking that she was suffering from the effects of acute stress. And that day she walked into her doctor's office and she immediately went from her doctor's office to another physician and basically was admitted to the hospital and started chemotherapy. It was that serious. It was that big of a deal. So imagine being in that situation with having your life completely change and flip upside down and everything that happened after that. Now, what's amazing about this interview is the lessons that Lydia learned about how to live her life authentically with intention and to take care of herself are so many of the things that we talk about on this podcast all the time. Like I said, you're going to think I paid her. I swear I did not pay this woman. She's just incredible. And the perspective she has for how people who aren't in the situation that she was in, who aren't facing cancer, who maybe aren't acutely in crisis right now, but people who do have the exact same opportunity to live their day with intention, and people who do face the thousands of decisions that we make on a daily basis, she has an incredible set of wisdom to share with us for how we can do that better. I am thrilled for you all to meet Lydia Slaby. Let's listen to her interview now. Lydia, I am so thrilled that you're joining us for this episode of the podcast, especially since I reached out to you and totally cold emailed you. So this is awesome. Thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So I always get really excited when there's somebody that I find online one way or the other, and I get so excited about their work and so excited about who they are and have to have them on, and they say yes. And it's awesome that you're here. So tell us a little bit about you, help us get to know you, and we'll dive into this awesome work that you're doing today.
Well, I'm me. I just turned 40. I worked for a long time in municipal government and then state government. And then I went and I got my JD MBA, and then I was working as an attorney. And then while I was working as an attorney was the beginning of the turning point that triggered my book, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But while I was working as an attorney, I got cancer. And that was 6.5 years ago now. And so my life since then has been really up and down in terms of managing my health and what it takes to do that. And then I quit being an attorney and I started writing my book, and now here's my life. And I'm married. I have 2 cats. I have no children. I lived for a long time in Chicago, but I now live in the Hudson River Valley of New York. And that's who I am.
Amazing. So you mentioned your book. We actually got connected because I found your book on Amazon as I'm, running around online looking for books to read and that type of thing. I came across your book. Your book is called Wait, It Gets Worse: Love, Death, and My Transformation from Control Freak to Human Being. And those of you who listen to me a lot, you know that a title like that would get me really excited. So maybe the place to start is to just dive in and have you tell us a little bit about your book, because it has so much to do with the pieces of you and your backstory that you just mentioned. So tell us a little bit about the book itself.
So the book itself, while I was sick, I found myself writing a lot. I've always had careers where I wrote. I mean, being a lawyer, all you do is write. But I was finding that I needed to write creatively, and it was personal. It was blog kind of writing, but I had to write. And so when I was trying to get better after being sick, I found that I had to write about it. It was my own way of healing. Everybody has their own way of healing, and mine was to write about it. And so that's where the book came from. What the book is about is, it's funny. I describe it this way and people laugh at me, but the plot of the book is me getting sick and then me getting better, and then how to actually recover from a dramatic, life-threatening illness that, for me, came across almost as a trauma. Like some people get cancer and it grows for a while, and then you're sick for a while, and then you're better, and there's no dramatic hospital moment. I had way too many dramatic hospital moments for anybody's comfort. And so it took me a long time to get over that. And so that's the plot of the book. And then intermixed with that is a really beautiful love story. Well, I think it's a really beautiful love story. It's the love story that I have with my husband. And so you sort of get intrigued with the book that way. But what I've done, not entirely on purpose, is I've snuck in all of these little bits of, well, this is how I recovered from that. And then over here, this is what happened over here when I was recovering from that. Oh, and this is what I was thinking about when I was thinking about that. And so my editor was joking with me. She was like, it's self-help, even though it's a memoir. And I was like, oh. And it's interesting. A lot of the early feedback I've been getting is, thank you so much for your perspective on that. I'd never really thought about approaching a situation like that in quite that way. So it's this very dramatic plot, but there is this subsect of pieces of advice that I hope people could use.
So you mentioned that a big catalyst of this book was your cancer diagnosis. Can you take us back to when you were diagnosed? What was going on in your life? What triggered you to feel like something might have been wrong? Like, what was that experience like getting diagnosed?
Deeply traumatic is the short answer. But the longer answer, I was working as an attorney. I was in Chicago. I was working at one of the big law firms that scatter this world. And I was a first-year attorney, so I was very busy, 14-hour days, sort of 6 days a week-ish. And about 3 months before my diagnosis, I was diagnosed in June, so starting around March, I had a hard time exercising. And I've always been an athlete. I was a Division I rower. I've always been an athlete. And I had a hard time running. And at first I couldn't run for as long. I couldn't do 4 miles, and then I couldn't really do 3 miles. And eventually, the week before I was diagnosed, I couldn't jog across the street without needing to catch my breath. And about a month before my diagnosis, I went and I saw my doctor, and she basically was like, well, I think you've pulled a muscle. Take some Advil and you'll feel better. And I was like, okay. I'm not a huge fan of being overly tested. And so my husband was actually furious that I hadn't gotten an x-ray or anything. He was like, there's something going on in your chest. And I was like, no, it's no problem. It's just a pulled muscle. Stop feeding, the medical wasteland of too much money. And 2 days before I was diagnosed, I was working out. And the gentleman I was working out with looked at me and he was like, there's something wrong with you. Like, please sit down. He was like, you are pale green. you're sweating, you can't do anything that you usually do. Like, I don't know if you have walking pneumonia. I don't know what is going on with you, but please go to your doctor. And it was funny because I'd been hearing it from friends. Oh, don't look so great. And like, oh, you've lost a lot of weight. And I did actually have all of the very typical symptoms of cancer. I'd lost a ton of weight. I was having night sweats. And I was just ignoring it. I was just fully convinced it was stress. There's also an aspect here that my sister is also a cancer survivor. And she'd been going through cancer for about 6 years at that point. And so weird symptoms in my family weren't something that I really wanted to pay close attention to. And so the day of my diagnosis, I went and I saw my general practitioner, and she said, oh, she gave me an inhaler for my breathing issue. But then she was listening to my heart, and she said, there's something going on with your heart. I need you to see a cardiologist. And I was like putting my shirt back on. And I was like, okay, great. Like, let me know. I'll, in a week. And she was like, no. You can't go back to the office. You're going to sit here in my waiting room until I get you in to see the cardiologist.
Wow.
And that was a moment of, okay, life just got a little bit more interesting. And then I saw the cardiologist, and he basically, what we eventually learned was that I had a tumor the size of a grapefruit that was sitting basically on top of my heart. And so my doctor heard my right ventricle collapsing every time my heart beat. And what the cardiologist saw was a huge amount of liquid surrounding my heart. My heart had basically built up its own protection. And so this liquid was causing all of this pressure. He didn't know why. He couldn't see the tumor. He just knew that there was all of this liquid. And so he sent me to the emergency room. It was too late in the day for him to admit me to the hospital. And so he sent me to the emergency room. And in the emergency room, they were like, oh, fun. You're not a gunshot victim. You're not a child with food poisoning or an ear infection. Like, this is going to give us a chance to wield our diagnosis muscles. And so they gave me an x-ray, and then they gave me a CAT scan. And I first heard the word lymphoma while I was sitting in the emergency room. And then they wouldn't let me out of the hospital. I had a series of tests, and I eventually found an oncologist within 24 hours. And nobody let me out of the hospital for 2 weeks until I'd had my first round of chemotherapy. So it was very dramatic the way that I was diagnosed. I started as an acute cardiac patient, and then suddenly I had cancer, and then suddenly I was going through chemotherapy, and then suddenly I was home. And it was like, what just happened to me? So that was how I was diagnosed with cancer.
I can't imagine how all of that must have felt, because folks who have listened to this for a while know this. People who are tuning in for the first time likely don't, but I have multiple sclerosis, and I remember very vividly the day that I was diagnosed, and it was similar. Like, literally 5 minutes before they told me what I had, I would have told you I'm a quote unquote healthy person. Like, I'm fine. Like, I'm a healthy person. But it's weird because you're healthy until somebody tells you you're not. Like, it isn't, it sounds so stupid to say it that way, but it literally is. Like, I would have said, no, I'm a healthy person, in the same way that I say I have green eyes. Like, this is a permanent thing about me, but it's not.
Right.
It isn't.
I eat properly. I exercise. I'm healthy. No, exactly. Very similar.
Can't imagine. Okay. So you get this diagnosis. You're like, holy cow. They start treatment right away. You're detained in the hospital. All of that happens. Where did it go from there? Because, it's really interesting, the direction your book takes about almost a transformation, or, in what I read on Amazon, an imperfect rebirth. But obviously that experience of going through that condition, that disease, it had a profound impact. Again, it seems dumb to say that. Of course it did. But I'm curious if you can just take us through what happened after that.
You hear a lot that people have life-threatening moments, and suddenly they wake up the next day, and every day's a new day, and I have to carpe diem and all of this stuff. And that's very true. But when I was going through treatment, and then after I came out of treatment, I was very lucky. I had 4 months of chemotherapy. It was horrible. And then basically I was done. I ended up having a surgery to remove what remained of the tumor, which involved cracking open my chest, which was a whole, a physical kind of trauma. But in terms of cancer, I was done after the 4 months of chemotherapy. And it was horrible, but at the same time, it was comforting in that, like, I knew I had to go to the hospital. I knew why I was going to the hospital. And we knew what we were doing there. We were doing this very specific treatment, and it was going to make me better. And so for really the first time in my life, I had no questions about what I was doing with my life and why I was doing it, which is a remarkable gift in this society, because I feel like the only question we really have is like, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And what do you want to do with yourself? And what are you doing? And those questions are so impossible to answer in a cohesive way that sometimes it's just really nice to have someone say, you're going to the hospital because you have to get this treatment in order to save your life. And so in a really wonderful way, cancer simplified my life. So coming out of that kind of simplified clarity in my life was really hard. When I eventually went back to work after the surgery, I felt like I was a round peg and I was trying to fit myself into a square hole. I mean, I'd always been very driven. I'd always worked really hard. I'd always had very interesting jobs. And for the first time in my life, I was looking around myself and going, what the hell am I doing here? Like, what am I doing with my life? What am I doing in this job? What's happening? And it was such an uncomfortable feeling for me, because I was so used to having all of the answers when people would throw questions at me like that, and when my own brain would throw questions at me like that, that suddenly not having an answer that made me feel authentic was really traumatizing for me. And I went back to work in May, and then I worked for a year and a half. And then the following August, so 18 months later in August, I had the episode that basically triggered the title of the book. But I had a medical procedure that basically went wrong, and they poked a hole in my heart. And so I had to have emergency open heart surgery, and they had to fix that. And I was once again out of the office for 10 weeks and once again recovering from a really major surgery that was entirely unnecessary, right? And it was that moment where I was like, okay, all right, Team Lydia, like, I am smart enough and I am, clever enough, and I have enough people in my life that someone on this planet should be able to tell me why everything just went so wrong. Like, I had cancer, I got better from cancer, I did everything that everybody told me to do. I went back to work, I went back to the gym, I, figured out my life. And yet I still just had this moment where I almost died on a surgical table, and I had to spend 10 weeks recovering from it. And this is insane. Like, what am I doing wrong in my life? Like, what's happening? And for the first time in my life, I'm not a particularly up until that point, I hadn't had a lot of faith in my life. I went to, an Episcopal school when I was growing up, and I ostensibly was Christian and, celebrated Christmas, and I would go to church every once in a while. But the idea of like a God or whoever it is that we all think of up there, that had never really been a huge part of my life. And suddenly, after the heart surgery, I was like, okay, I need someone to give me an answer who doesn't have a human brain, because my human brain has not been helpful in the last year and a half, because clearly something's gone wrong because of everything I've just gone through. And so I think that might be the imperfect transformation part, is that I really struggled for 2 years. I was really trying to shoehorn myself back into my old life, and suddenly it didn't work. And so then I had to come up with a new life that would work. And I found myself, basically a friend of mine shoved me into the path of an indigenous healer from Peru. And through conversations with him and sweat lodge type ceremonies, it began to open my eyes to a different way of living my life. And it's that life that I'm living now. And it's still not perfect. I mean, no life is perfect, but it showed me that I'd spent my entire life ignoring my body. I'd spent a great deal of my life trying to control things that were completely out of my control. And so it basically taught me to let go and to have a little bit of faith that things were going to be okay, even though I'd let go of all of that control.
Hi, friends. I'm interrupting this podcast episode with a very important announcement. Have you ever looked at your calendar for the week and felt completely overwhelmed? Do you find yourself saying yes over and over to other people, which means you're saying no over and over to your own needs? And when it comes down to it, does your free time amount to tiny bits of time confetti here and there with no real time to focus on any one thing? I totally know how that feels. And if that sounds like you, you're going to want to hear this. I'm partnering with my incredible friend Leslie, the mastermind behind the blog Mom's Hierarchy of Needs, to offer an absolutely free webinar called Setting Value-Based Boundaries. During this webinar, we'll uncover your 5 most important personal values. Then we'll use them during a design thinking exercise that takes aim at your weekly calendar. You'll walk away with an intentional set of boundaries that are aligned to your personal values to help you finally get your calendar under control. Join us for this absolutely free webinar in the evening on April 9th. We're only offering it once. Sign up at aprilseifert.com/webinar or just hit the link in this episode description. I can't wait to see you guys there. It's interesting because I've talked with a number of friends who have experienced a lot of adversity, whether it's the loss of somebody close to them or a health diagnosis like you're talking about. And the best way that I've been able to come up with what the couple of really adverse events that I've been through in my life, my diagnosis and my dad's death, the best way I've been able to come up with it is when you go through something like that, it's exactly as you describe. Like everything gets, in the same way that it gets more complicated, there's a lot of information involved. Like people want to tell you a lot of things about your immune system and a lot of information. Life itself becomes much more simple. It's your decisions are much clearer. It's like, I'm going to do this thing because it's good for me. I'm not doing that other thing because it's not, because right now I'm taking care of myself and that's my priority. So things become simple. And I hearken it to, and I'm going to age myself a little bit, but I hearken it to a situation like seeing The Matrix for the first time. Like once you see The Matrix, you can't unsee it. It's hard to come back from it. And once you see the simplicity of it, because that simplicity is there for everyone. Like I talk about this a lot on the podcast, but it's a beautiful time to talk about it with you because you just explained it so concisely. Every single person has their one life. Every single person is going to experience threats against that life, whether it's through medical diagnoses or otherwise. And every single one of us is going to end up in the same place. Like it's going to come to an end at some point. And so we all have that same opportunity to really think about what our values and what we care about, what those things are. And maybe not to the same degree as when you're going through, an intense treatment like that, but to a much greater degree than we all do on a day-to-day basis, we can simplify. Like we can create that target and that hierarchy of what we care about, those values, those people, those things, and other things fall below them. And that does simplify our decision-making. We all could do that. You don't need cancer to do that.
No,
but somehow it happens more easily after you get a crazy diagnosis.
Yeah, it does. It was interesting because actually the first thing that I noticed with my life, and it happened while I was in the hospital, is that I got increasingly impatient with people who didn't support me. And it was that was my first stage of realizing that I have control over my choices, which means that I have control over the people that I choose to let into my life and the people that I choose not to. And that it was that was the first level. And so just, the people who weren't team players in the team Lydia, and I'm not saying they had to march to my drum, but there's a certain kind of personality that shows up in these situations, and there's a certain kind of personality that doesn't show up in these situations. And it got super clear to me which was the personalities that I wanted in my life. And it was so easy for me to just shed off the ones that weren't serving me. And because it was so easy to do that in like a world of, oh my God, I have to be nice to everyone and I have to always maintain all of these connections, because that was so easy for me to do, suddenly these other things that I thought had been so difficult or not allowed, like questioning my own, choices and self-worth and all of the rest of it, suddenly that started getting a little easier. And I think you're right. I mean, my sister's gone through cancer. There's been deaths in my life, and I went through it because of cancer. But, the minute that any human kind of hits a moment of, okay, I need to really figure out what it is in my life that's serving me and what it is in my life that isn't. It's a wonderful moment of recognizing the value of your own choices. I agree with you.
And it's as though I paid you. It is as though I swear I didn't. And I swear people listening to this, we didn't conspire to this degree. We talked a little about the direction we were going to go, but not to this degree. Lydia, something else that I talk about often on the podcast, and you are such a beautiful example of it, because this is the situation right here that you're talking about. You have cancer, you're in the hospital, you're getting treatment for it, right? Something that I talk about often on the podcast is this notion that I call radical responsibility. Like you should take responsibility for 100% of the situations you're in, like 100% of the time, 100% responsibility. And what you were doing, and that it's different than being at fault or to blame. Like this isn't backward looking. This isn't you, Lydia, you deserved cancer because you did this thing. And so you are to blame and you brought that on. That has nothing to do with it. What it has to do with is, here I am. I find myself in these circumstances. I'm in the hospital. I have cancer. I'm being treated for it. What do I do now? Like, what are my decisions now? What control do I have? Which people are allowed to see me and which ones aren't? How do I spend my time? What am I going to do now in order to make sure that, exactly as you said, all of these people and things serve me? And that's what I'm talking about with this notion of radical responsibility. Like, I don't care what situation you're in. I don't care if you had nothing to do with getting yourself there. No one else is going to take control to the degree that you will, because no one else is living that life. Like, no one else has as much vested in your happiness as you do. And so for you to make that decision, like, nah, those people that are not on board with the direction we're going right now, they're just not invited to the party anymore. That's amazing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. And I actually, I didn't quite realize what was going on until I was writing the epilogue to my book. And then suddenly I was like, oh, wait, hold on. Because it's exactly that. And no, I swear to God, you did not pay me. And I didn't meet you before you cold emailed me a few weeks ago. But we have 100% control over our bodies and our choices and our reactions. And we have 0% control over anything else. And my problem going into the hospital when I was first diagnosed is that I thought I had 100% control over everything outside of me, and I'd forgotten how to have responsibility over what was happening inside me. So I was one of those people who would, be fully convinced that I could control the weather, because I was apparently a crazy person. But I'd forgotten that I had control over my own reactions and my own life. And so that's really been like the whole crux of my personal life mission for the last 6.5 years, is making sure that I am exactly who I want to be in any situation that's presented to me. And it may be a horrible situation. It may be a wonderful situation. It may be, a man running naked down the street. I mean, like, who knows? But like, I'm going to be kind, and I'm going to be forgiving, and I am going to be thoughtful, and I am going to protect, myself and the people that I love. And it's a different kind of control. And I mean, the subtitle of my book is something from control freak to human being. And people laugh at me because they're like, Lydia, you're still a little bit of a control freak. And I'm like, I'm a hyper control freak about how I react to situations. but I no longer try and control how you react to situations. And that's a big difference in my life.
That's huge.
And so it was funny. It was like, the guy who, I mean, when you're going through chemotherapy, there's certain foods that you just can't eat. Like, this is sort of chemo 101 a little bit. And there was a friend of ours who just would keep bringing sushi, and I couldn't have raw fish. And I really wanted raw fish because I love sushi, but he kept bringing sushi to the hospital. And finally, I kind of looked at him and I was like, dude, if you can't take like a simple instruction on this one, like, what are you doing here? And, he got really offended, and then we had to clean that up. And then finally I was amazing. Like, I have no time for this in my life. Like, I have no time to coach someone about whether or not to bring sushi to a chemo patient. Like, and, we're perfectly cordial to each other whenever we see each other now, but I would not consider him as close of a friend as he once was. And I'm okay with that. I am completely fine with that. And it took me a long time to get okay with something like that.
Absolutely. Well, we're so conditioned, right? Like you mentioned it before. Make sure that you're nice to everyone. And I've lived my life in the upper Midwest, so we're hyper conditioned to make sure that we're not putting anyone out. We say we're sorry 200 times a day for the dumbest things. Like, I mean, I'll bump into somebody, or they'll literally be standing in the same aisle in the grocery store that I need to walk down. And as I walk by them, oh, sorry. I'm like, you're essentially apologizing because you exist and take up a human amount of space. Like, it's totally fine. You super don't have to apologize for that. But we're conditioned to do that. And it's interesting because it's to our own detriment that carries out, because we have a certain number of days to hang out, and there are people and experiences and amazing things that we could be experiencing and we could be spending our time doing. And it just isn't worth it to be wasting time and energy on things that just aren't aligned. I mean, that aren't aligned with who we want to be and who we actually are and how we want our day to go and feel. And it's not selfish, because the side of the coin, the opposite side of that radical responsibility coin, is exactly what you mentioned. It's that external piece. Not only are you 100% responsible for yourself, they are 100% responsible for themselves and their happiness. You are not responsible for their happiness, meaning like you saying yes or no, or having an opinion, or wanting to hang out or not, that's not determining, or it shouldn't be. You shouldn't be taking that on. That's not your job. Your job is to live your own life. Don't, intentionally go out there trying to hurt people, but that's not likely what normal people would do. I mean, you shouldn't take on that undue burden of someone else's experience. That's theirs. They have their own life to live.
Yep, exactly.
Amazing.
Exactly. So,
okay, break this down for people who... I'm looking for some practical advice here. Like, what do you tell people, like your, friends of yours or family members or whoever? What can we take from this experience that you went through? And maybe you go through this in the book. Admittedly, I have not read your book. I just got really excited about it on Amazon and just like knee-jerk emailed you. But
you're amazing. I'm going to send you an early copy.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you. I'm so excited. But what can people take away from this? Because again, we all have lives. Like, we all have the same one life in front of us. What can we learn from your experience to get to that point that you're at now, or help us maybe move closer to it if we haven't gone through a cancer diagnosis or something huge like this?
Well,
ready, impart some wisdom. None of you ready, go.
Right. Well, there's two things. There's three things, really. I mean, if we think of ourselves as body, mind, and spirit, body, mind, and soul, body, mind, and whatever that ethereal is that is me, because we think of our mind as something that belongs to me, and so therefore me is not my mind, and same deal with my body, right? So I think of the human being sort of like these three little entities all living inside the body at the same time. And we have to take care of all three of them, right? This is the only body I will have for the entirety of my life. I've had it since before I was born, and I will have it until the moment I die. And it is my one true partner, along with my mind, that I have to make sure I take care of. Otherwise, this life gets pretty short pretty quick. And so my deep desire is to have and this is partially because I'm terrible at it, but learning what we can from our body's wisdom is a really interesting way to go about life. I was a sickly kid. There's very little reasons I should have survived until I was an adult. I'm kind of a miracle of modern medicine in a lot of ways, and not just from cancer, but from everything else. And so my body is not as strong as, say, Dwayne Johnson. Like, I'm not a Dwayne Johnson, and that's okay because I'm me and he's him. But recognizing that that's true is something that took me a long time to get used to. And so I can't work 14-hour days. Like, I literally cannot do the job that I used to do because in some respects, I don't know if it gave me cancer, but it certainly didn't help when I was sick. But that's okay. Some people can work 14-hour days. And the trick is to start paying attention to your body to know enough when things like that are beginning to happen. And we tend to overrule our bodies because society, especially Western society, asks a lot out of who we are. We feed ourselves toxic foods. We live in toxic environments. We deal with a great deal of stress. I mean, none of this is good for the human body, right? So how to actually take care of our body is super important. And learning to pay attention to your body and what it can do to serve you and what it needs to be healthy. So that's the first thing that I really want, that I really tried to make clear in the book was, learning your own body. The other thing was we spoke a great deal about it, but recognizing when you're making a choice, because we make thousands of choices a day and 9/10 of them we don't even realize we're doing. But knowing that we're making these choices suddenly gives us a remarkable amount of agency over our lives that sometimes it feels like we're at the whim of whatever vengeful God is out there. And sometimes we feel like we're at the whim of whatever merciful God is out there. And in so many situations, we're not at the whim of any of them. We're just at the whim of our mind making choices for us without our realizing it. So recognizing that we're making choices at all times. It was interesting. I mentioned that I basically went straight from the emergency room into the cancer ward and into chemotherapy. And my family is one that tries to find non-Western medications when there is an opportunity for a non-Western medication.
Yep.
And I didn't have the time to do that. I didn't have time to think about any options in terms of my treatment. And I remember getting on the phone with my sister, and this was the first time that I actually really thought about this. And she was like, listen, I know it feels like you don't have any choices, but you do. You could get up and walk out of the hospital, which you're not going to do. So she was like, recognize that choice. And she was like, and recognize this other choice of by choosing to stay in the hospital, you are choosing to receive this treatment. So she was like, so own it. Own that choice. Because if you're not going to own that choice, then whatever side effect you have from chemo for the rest of your life, and she'd gone through 3 chemo treatments at this point, so she had some experience on this one. She was like, whatever chemo treatment, whatever side effect you have, you're going to blame the doctors for, or you're going to blame the cancer for, or you're going to blame, whatever you decide gave you the cancer. The list can go on, right? But she was like, but you are, by choosing to save your life, choosing this route. She was like, don't make yourself regret that choice. Just own it. Just say, you know what? I'm losing my hair because of a choice that I made. I wish that there had been a different choice, sure, but this is a choice that I made, and that's okay. And being able to own my choices in that way, especially when I felt like I was in a no-win situation and I didn't have a choice and I was being railroaded and this, that, and the other. I mean, all of the reasons why we as humans lash out, right? We feel like we feel like we're just being railroaded by life. I had a choice. And when I owned that choice, it suddenly made my treatment a billion times easier.
That's powerful. That's so powerful.
Well, thank you. It was incredible. because you end up blaming anyone, right? You blame anyone except for yourself, even though at the end of the day, I was the one that got me into this situation. I mean, I can't say that I'm the one that gave me cancer, but I am certainly the one that made the choice to do chemotherapy. So that's another thing that I try and get through in the book is, it's not necessarily always like a chemotherapy dramatic choice, but, we're faced with these choices all the time, and own them. Own the choice that you make. It's incredibly powerful, and it's really satisfying. Because suddenly it's like, oh, I do have control over my life. Like, I don't have to control your behavior because I just controlled how I reacted to your behavior. It's actually done wonders for my marriage too, because, when two personalities are in a room, it's really important to be responsible for the one that you have control over.
Absolutely. This is amazing. I literally, I'm just sitting over here smiling because, again, people are going to think I paid you to say half of this stuff. And it's just wonderful. It's so wonderful to hear some of these important concepts be expressed by someone who's been in who has a different perspective, who's been in a different situation, but the commonalities among the things that you've just said, the things that I experienced in my health situation, and so many of the women that I've interviewed on this podcast, it's just incredible how consistent those messages are. I literally, like I said, I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but we don't have that kind of time on a podcast. So what I will say is tell my audience where they can find your book, where they can connect with you. This story is so powerful. I just want to make sure that everybody knows where they can go to dive even deeper into it and get a copy of your book.
The book is called Wait, It Gets Worse. Wait, It Gets Worse. Love, Death, and My Transformation from Control Freak to Human Being. It comes out on March 19th, and it is currently available for pre-order on Amazon. But I do know that a lot of independent bookstores are going to be carrying it. And so if you have a favorite independent bookstore, walk into it. And if they don't have it, ask them to order it. And you can find me. I'm mostly on Instagram, but I'm sometimes on Facebook and even more rarely on Twitter. But I'm Lydia Slaby, Lydia Slaby as in boy, Y. And on the internet, I'm also Lydia Slaby, lydiaslaby.com. So you can find me anywhere. And I have a little mailing list that I send out a little note to every now and again. I'm still also writing my blog, although it's not as frequently as it was when I was sick. But I do on occasion post a blog post. So you can find me there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for responding to my cold email out of the blue. And I'm just really thrilled with the chance to get to know you and to hear more about your background, to hear about your amazing book, and in particular, the incredible lessons that you shared with us. It was really powerful.
Well, thank you. It's been a total delight getting to know you, April.
I mean, come on now. Could she be any cooler? I mean, that was just incredible. I'm sure after listening to that, you can tell exactly what I meant when I said it is going to sound like I paid this woman to say these things on this podcast. And I swear to you, I did not. She admitted it. I did not pay her. It was just this incredible situation to have found this book on Amazon, or well, the pre-book, the advertisement for the book on Amazon, and to have reached out to her out of nowhere. And here we are with this incredible woman with so much wisdom to share with us on this episode. I'm just so grateful. Things I want to call out. I loved how she talked about the simplicity that her life took on when she was in treatment. I mean, the way that she described it, like she knew exactly what she was doing and why, like the why behind the decisions she was making. I'm taking chemotherapy because I have cancer and I'm hoping this will make me better. So many of our decisions are, I mean, heck, the jobs we do and some of the relationships we're in and the friendships we have and how we spend our time, we don't make those decisions with intention, and we have no idea the why behind why we're doing them. We just sort of passively do them. And it wasn't until she was faced with this hugely scary and traumatic event that why became crystal clear and life simplified. And we have that choice. We have that choice to simplify our lives by getting really clear about what our values are and getting really clear about what's important to us and what's not. and what's not. And letting those things dictate how we spend our time and what we say yes to, and ultimately what we say no to, and who we say yes to, and who we say no to. And that's huge. And I'm going to go down the path secondarily to radical responsibility. Here you have it. If I hear one piece of feedback about my discussions of radical responsibility on this podcast, it's that, yeah, but what about when I'm in times of crisis? Sometimes really bad things happen. Yes, they do. And you still have responsibility for your reaction and what you do going forward. And Lydia's situation is a beautiful example of that. I swear to God, I did not pay her to say that. It was just amazing to think about a woman sitting in the hospital having chemotherapy saying, I'm responsible for myself right now. I'm responsible for my reaction, and I'm responsible for what I do from here. That's huge. And that is a sense of control that few of us ever get to experience because we're not willing to take on that responsibility. And she did. And that sense of control, it's incredible the way that she described it, right? Like she suddenly realized that what she had control over was what was inside of her. She couldn't control the things that were outside of her. And she'd spent her whole life trying to do the opposite. Holy cow, I about fell over when she said that. It's such an important piece of wisdom. And finally, she talked about us as human beings being composed of all three, body, mind, and spirit, and the importance of getting to know each of those separate entities and taking care of them. Her point about her job and her 14-hour days probably didn't cause her cancer, but it certainly wasn't helping. How many times have we ignored signs and symptoms in our bodies and just forced it to do things that weren't okay? And how many times have we ignored personal boundaries or personal needs, and we haven't fed our spirit or, fed ourselves the way that we need to in order to feel good and optimally perform and just be our best selves on a day-to-day basis? It was just cool how she broke apart those three things and gave such practical wisdom and advice about how we can keep all three of them in mind and get to know them and listen to them. And ultimately, those three things together are what make us a human being and make us the best human being we can when we take care of them. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview as much as I did. I was just beaming and smiling from ear to ear over here as Lydia was talking, because she is one of those people who has seen the Matrix and can't unsee it. And so many times, my goal with these episodes is to give you a glimpse behind the curtain and let you see that Matrix a little bit so that you take it forward into your daily lives, and that your day-to-day experience and the decisions, the thousands of them that you make on a day-to-day basis, those happen with more intention. You start to think about them a little bit more. I hope that happened this week. All right. Love you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I appreciate it every single week. If there's somebody in your life who needs to hear this message, shoot this episode over to them. I'd really appreciate it. And if you have thoughts, shoot me a message. I'd love to hear from you. And if you know somebody inspirational, send them to me. I'd love to interview them. All right, you guys. See you next week. Before we close out today, I want to say thank you to my producer, Cameron Hill, and to my incredible sponsor, Modern Well. If you want to learn more about how you can reach your goals in a one-of-a-kind work-life community, visit www.modernwell.co. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who might benefit from this inspiring message. And if you have a moment, click the link in the episode description to leave me a rating and a review on iTunes. It would mean so much to me. Finally, I want to remind you that it is absolutely possible to live a happy, fulfilling life, even in spite of all of the chaos and demands we all experience. Sign up at aprilseifert.com to gain access to tools that will help you do just that. I have carefully created and curated a set of tools that combine the powerful fields of psychology and design thinking to help you intentionally create a fulfilling, happy life you love. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and until next week, stay inspired.